Thank you, Robert. So I am going to share my screen. I think you can see the clouds. So give me a second to get the presentation up. All right. So Hanes Cymru, the history of Wales. The focus is going to be on the late 19th century politics. Just so you know, I'm Huw. Welcome, Croeso. This is a talk. It's meant to be just that, a discussion. And in the American fashion, I'll take questions and put them in the chat, and I'll answer as I see them or as more likely Robert sees them. So I want to give you a flavor, a taste of politics in Cymru in the 19th century, particularly the late 19th century, but all that led up to it also. So the first thing I'm going to show you is a political map. Um, the map is of the state, the Westminster state at the time, in 1859. And you'll notice that it includes all of the island of Ireland, as well as Scotland, Cymru, and England. The um, the first thing I would ask you to notice, look at Wales in particular, and I have a little inset here which shows Wales mostly blue. And that means that the Conservatives had most of the constituencies. And the constituencies were like American House constituencies, um, except that they were more than one member. So some constituencies had one member, some had two. So what would happen is people would vote and the top two would win, and you'd have two members of parliament for your area. And you can notice that some of these checked areas, like around Carmarthen, um, had one of each opposing party within the constituency. But you'll notice that Wales is mostly blue. And the second thing I would ask you to look at is the number of votes. So for Wales entire, for Cymru entire, there were 17 Conservative MPs and 15 Liberal ones. But the number of people who could vote was very limited. 2,767 votes for the Conservatives, 1,585 for the Liberal. And again, this is in 1859, and the process of changing the franchise had already begun and was well on the way to changing the politics of Wales. But you'll notice that this was the picture in 1859. And the reason why Wales was mostly conservative at that time was that the people who could vote were landed gentry. And these people who were um, Anglican, mostly by this time English speaking, and often absent for large periods of time, were the ruling class in Wales. The people themselves were the antithesis of that. They were Protestant, but not Anglican. So they were what was called nonconformists. They were either Baptist, Methodist, Congregationalist, or independent, which might sometimes be called primitive Baptist in American terms. And most of Wales was not Anglican. Um, and those people who had no land, who spoke Welsh, um, could not vote. And in addition to the House of Commons, there's also the House of Lords. So many of the people who owned land also had lordships and a seat in the House of Lords. And the House of Lords was as powerful as the House of Commons is today. So they could veto legislation even though they weren't elected. So this was the general picture of Wales in 1859. And to give you a little clue, Wales has never voted Tory ever since. Um, it just has never done that. So to give you more context as to the electoral reforms and how this expanded the franchise, I'm going to show you a list of legislation. The process started in 1832. Um, the rotten boroughs, as they were so called, were removed. So imagine a house district in America, say the Colorado South, something like that. It would have 500,000 or so voters who could, vote in a person with a plurality. Um, in 1832, you would have areas that were as large as that, but would have, say, 7 voters. So the people who could vote um, was very limited and it was kind of corrupt. So in 1832, knowing that the French Revolution had happened, the American Revolution had happened, the ruling classes in the House of Commons decided to like make more people vote. And over time, in 1867 in particular, they extended the franchise so that more men could vote. And in 1872, the ballots became secret so that if you were a tenant farmer, for instance, you wouldn't get evicted if you voted against your landlord, which, by the way, happened. And then in 1884, the franchise was extended to all adult males, and then various other reforms, most significantly, the extension of the franchise to females occurred in 1918 and 1928. So this um, this political system, the Westminster system, gradually changed over time. And at the same time as the Westminster system changing, in Cymru, there was a lot of discontent because of increasing change. So at the start of the Industrial Revolution, the largest town in Wales was Carmarthen. The London of Wales, it was called. It had about 2,000 people in 1800, and it was the largest town in Wales. Now, Wales or Cymru was an early crucible of the Industrial Revolution, and places like Merthyr suddenly started to have large increases in population because of the iron and coal works being placed there in proximity to the minerals. So, you know, conditions of people coming into areas that previously had nothing became bad for the population. And the you can imagine what an early industrial revolution town could be like. It would be chaotic. People would be moving in and out. Sometimes they would go back to their, rural place of living, seasonally and come to work, when there was work. But during this period, Wales was changing dramatically. Its population was increasing dramatically from like 500,000 at the beginning of the 1800s up to 2 million, touching 2 million by the end of the century. And this combination of industrial change and populations moving around, and Wales essentially colonizing itself, its rural population moving into the south, and some population movement from Ireland and from England into Wales as well, caused a lot of discontent. People didn't like change, but there was a lot of change. And the change was occurring in the industrial areas and the rural areas. And what didn't help was the attitude of the English state um, to the Welsh. They blamed a lot of this discontent that was occurring and manifesting itself on Welsh speakers and the moral capacity of the Welsh people. So, in summary, the Industrial Revolution in Wales was kind of unique. It was an early crucible of things like, making steel. The population changed, it moved southwards. Um, the South was industrial and Welsh speaking. Normal life changed in the rural areas and in the industrial areas, and patterns of work changed. And there was a lot of discontent, and I'm going to talk about those discontent, examples of those discontent, very famous examples um, that occurred.
Um,
So go
Hugh,
ahead.
before we go further, Luann had a question. I don't know. Luann, do you want to unmute and just ask your question to Hugh?
Sure. Um, how would they know whether you voted for your landlord or not? Weren't the ballot or the votes private?
The votes weren't private until 1872. So what
Oh,
would
interesting.
so what would happen was on election day, landlords would take the people who could vote to the pubs, get them drunk, and try to get them to vote for them. And the vote was in public. So imagine a public square where you would declare your vote. You just raise your hand, and it was very obvious to see who you voted for. Um, so if you're a tenant and you voted against your landlord, they would know because they would physically see you vote against them. And in
So,
1868,
I'm sorry.
and in 1868, a lot of people in Wales were evicted um, because they decided to vote Liberal against their landlords. And that was even before the secret ballot.
Oh, interesting. And how would that apply to the Chartist of the 1840s?
Well, the Chartists campaigned for secret ballots and for an extension of the franchise and for paying politicians so that ordinary people could become politicians. So the Chartists were in agreement with these reforms that eventually happened when it came to the extension of democracy to normal working people.
Yay, my great great grandfather was on the right side of history.
So I'm going to talk about the Chartists shortly.
Thank
Bear
you.
with me, and we can talk a little bit more about it. Um, so as you can see, let's see, um, there were various risings in Merthyr Tydfil, Newport, and in Sirga, Carmarthenshire. Um, we're going to talk about the first first event, the Merthyr Rising. So hopefully you can see a picture here of a flag being raised, which is a depiction of the Merthyr Rising from one of the newspapers of the time. And the image is in the public domain. You can go get it. And essentially, the Merthyr Rising involved around 7,000 people marching on Merthyr in protest at their conditions. So they had low wages. They were starving. So they shouted "Caws a bara," cheese and bread. We want cheese and bread. And there were some political slogans as well, like "Down with the king," "I lawr ar brenin." And these 7,000 people marched and raised the flag. And the legend and probability is it's the first time the red flag of revolution is raised in Europe. So this flag was red and it represented working people. And the local authorities had to call for help from the army to take the town, but it took 4 days, which shows you the intensity of the opposition. And again, these people were very aware of the French Revolution, and the English authorities or the Anglican authorities didn't want that kind of revolution over here. So next is the Newport Rising. This is about 10 years later, about coincident with the Rebecca riots, which is what I'm going to talk about next. It is a political protest, again, at the poor conditions. And for instance, wages were low, but not only were wages low, you're often paid with coupons. And these coupons could be redeemed for produce at company shops. So the owners of the mines essentially were paying you in this currency and inflating the price of the goods that they sold you, and you had no choice but to use their currency to pay for the goods. And in addition, they were protesting at the lack of political representation, and the Chartists were the ones that organized the protest. Some of the Chartists believed in moral force, but the Chartists involved in this rising believed in physical force. So the initial idea was to sort of shame the authorities, but the Chartists essentially here turned violent to some degree. And they demanded the vote for everybody, paid MPs, as I mentioned earlier, the secret ballot. And one of the things that they asked for was annual elections. The reasoning behind it is that if you had working class MPs, you would have reforms that would benefit working people, and you would displace the ruling class in the House of Commons. And what they were looking for essentially was fair wages, safe working conditions, an end to childhood labor, and better education. So similarly, around the same time, the Rebecca riots started in rural Wales from about 1839 until about 1840. And this is an illustration of the people who participated in the riots. And these people communicated and commuted to industrial areas, back and forth. Sometimes work was in the rural areas, sometimes work was in the industrial areas. And these folks were protesting against economic conditions, especially the fact that their cost of living was increasing because of tariffs and taxes. So you would go down a road and you would have to pay a tax to, like a turnpike tax, to the person who had the gate. And if you were carrying lime or your crops back and forth to your farm in the market, you had to pay a toll. And these tolls were very unpopular because the owners were taking advantage of a captive market. They didn't repair the roads very well, and they just happened to be the same people who were the ruling class, Anglican landowners. They were in charge of the workhouses. They were in charge of the local judiciary. They owned everything. And now they were taking money directly out of the hands of farmers who needed lime for their crops and who needed to sell their crops in the market. So these riots occurred between 1839 and 1843. The men dressed as women. You'll notice that the leader of the riot is on a horse. There's two explanations for why they dressed as women. One is religious. they were doing the will of God by removing something that was unjust. And there's a story about Rebecca in the Bible. And these were the daughters of Rebecca and restoring justice to the land. And the other story is related to the tradition of the Ceffyl Pren, the wooden horse, where these folks would dress up in um, female garb and essentially go to the house of somebody who was breaking the social contract, who was like doing something antisocial, if you will, and essentially make threatening noises and shaming the people who were doing the work. So this was like an escalation of that tradition in Wales, where instead of just going to the house of the person who's causing you pain and shaming them, you were literally going to the economic part of the road, taking down the toll and scaring away the tollman and removing the structures. And these occurred quite often. And the protests occurred. Uh, they were trying to get rid of the toll system entirely. So essentially, when the farmers' costs were really high with rent and with falling prices, they were hurting economically, and protest was the result. And again, it's related to the politics of the time. It's related to the Industrial Revolution. These folks knew about the French Revolution. These folks were providing goods to industrial areas. And when that business was bad, everybody suffered. So moving to the next one. So this is a picture, a very famous picture, I think, of Dowlais in 1840. And it gives you an idea of the sort of scale and scope of the Industrial Revolution. So as the population increased, as the density of work increased and housing increased and immigration had effects, it really changed the landscape. And you can see that it doesn't look very nice, essentially. There's a lot of industrial pollution, there's squalor, there's inadequate facilities that need improvement. And people didn't really like living in these areas. The upside to the Industrial Revolution, though, was that when times were good for everybody, which means that the people who worked in these areas, when they had the day off, looked like English gentlemen, as a contemporary account said. They were well dressed. They had nice silk pocket handkerchiefs. They were prosperous, and they were prosperous enough to fund their own institutions for mutual aid or for their culture, for their language, like the Eisteddfod, or to fund newspapers and colleges and chapels. So essentially, the Industrial Revolution allowed Welsh culture and Welsh language to survive, because unlike other areas that were hit by the Industrial Revolution, they stayed put. They didn't disperse like the Scots. They didn't disperse like the Irish. Pretty much most Welsh people stayed in Wales, colonized their own country, essentially, and became rich from it. And what resulted was a fundamental change in society. The society grew from 500,000 to 2 million. And I'm going to show you a quote on the next slide that sort of gives you a sense of the change in capacity here. Essentially, by the time of the First World War, um, 500,000 people were working as coal miners. They produced 1/3 of the world coal exports, and the population essentially quadrupled. So much so that Glamorgan, right, had 1.5 million people in it, and the rest had 500,000 in it. So you can see that during the century, the Industrial Revolution was always a factor. And this also, the final thing I'll say about this is that there's a huge dependency on the prosperity of the British Empire. The Welsh people thought that the British Empire was bringing them prosperity. And this was true until it wasn't. And that rapid decline started just before World War One and never really recovered. But that's something that affected future politics. So moving on swiftly to 1868, just before the secret ballot was introduced, I want to show you the beginnings of the changing politics of Wales with the background that I just gave you. So you can see that the number of voters, instead of being like 2,500, now are in the tens of thousands, and the Conservatives got thumped. It was called election vow, the big election. And the Liberals, for the first time, took Wales and flipped the results so that essentially 2/3 of the people voted Liberal. And this was even before the secret ballot. And more people voted, and they voted for people who looked like themselves, essentially, and I'm sorry to say this, men, right? Nonconformists, so the Baptists, the Methodists, the Congregationalists, the Primitive Baptists, these people were Liberal MPs, and they now, instead of representing Anglican, English-speaking, ruling class, landowning interests, they now spoke about Welsh interests. And similarly, it's no coincidence that the first modern Eisteddfod was founded in this time. The effects of the Industrial Revolution was to make Wales prosperous. And it was prosperous in unusual ways. For instance, the immigration that occurred from Wales was very much unlike that of Ireland and Scotland, because the Welsh workers had skills which were industrial. And these skills were in demand in America and actually in the Ukraine. And these people who left, very small numbers compared to the Welsh population and the immigration of the Irish and the Scottish, but essentially they left to become really prosperous in places like Scranton, Utica, and Hughesville in Ukraine. So the Cymru of this time was Welsh speaking. It stayed Welsh speaking because of the Industrial Revolution. And it's really interesting to Marxist historians, actually, such as Eric Hobsbawm, George Roudet, or Gwyn Alf Williams. Those folks study Welsh history because it's kind of like the first example of where a proletariat forms in the context of this Marxist history, which coincidentally also starts to form in the mid-19th century. So I'm going to take you now to 1892. And again, you can see the election results. And by this time, all adult males could vote in secret. And you notice that the patterns of the countries are emerging. Wales is almost uniformly 31 out of 32 MPs are Liberal. In Ireland, most of these people here were of the Irish Party and supported Irish Home Rule. There are conservative Ulster Unionists up here in the north who wanted to stay part of Britain. In Scotland, most of the MPs are now Liberal, with the exception of where the poor were cleared out. So that's why you see huge areas of blue amongst all of the gold. And England is just a much more conservative country than the Celtic countries. So you can see that the Conservatives were predominant there. And because of England having a lot of Tories, the Liberal government of 1892 was very precarious. It was supported by the Irish nationalists and Welsh nationalists, essentially the Cymru Fydd people that I'm going to talk about. And so they had the majority, I think, of about 30. So the Irish nationalists and the Welsh Liberal votes combined were a powerful force between 1892 and 1894. So this was the point when the Welsh had the most leverage. And this is when T.E. Ellis, who I'm about to talk about, introduced Welsh disestablishment. So T.E. Ellis was one of the founding members of Cymru Fydd, which means Young Wales. He called for the establishment of a Welsh legislature. He was an example of a Welsh nationalist of this time who wanted home rule, but also wanted to be part of the British Empire. So he was one of the Liberals who Gladstone used and promoted into the whip's office. So he was accused of taking Saxon gold by other Welsh people, but he did fight for executive Welsh devolution in the Westminster state. So he's a very important figure. He died young, unfortunately, but he was one of the first kind of Welsh nationalist MPs in Westminster, but not nationalist in the Irish sense. They didn't want a different state, unlike the Irish. They just wanted it to be a country in the British Empire which ruled themselves, and for things like defense and imperial trade, that would be a imperial matter. So by this time, T.E. Ellis and Lloyd George also were essentially representing a Welsh people that were mostly Welsh speaking, mostly nonconformist, still had to pay a tax to the Church of England. They couldn't cremate their dead. The old order of the Anglican squires who owned the land, they were still powerful, and they still could take your land through what is called enclosure. They were still in existence, but they were no longer in the House of Commons. They were in the House of Lords. And the population had massively increased. And South Wales was one of the most prosperous, when it was prosperous, and industrialized places in the world. So at this time, Cymru fit the definition of a nation state because it had its own language, it had its own religion, which kept the Welsh people, separate from England. They had prosperity, they had their own press, and they viewed themselves as Welsh, and other peoples, like the English and the Scottish and the Irish, viewed them as Welsh. So in a sense, the nationalism of the time, which started with Napoleon, and the idea of a Welsh nation state started to appear. And the idea that Wales could be its own country essentially became common. So I am going to move to the next slide. So if you know your international politics, you'll know at this time, by about in the mid 19th century, Italy, for instance, was, instead of being like a series of kingdoms in 1829, ruled by the Austrians and some Italians and by the Pope and by some parts of France and the Bourbons, essentially became its own country. And the same happened to Germany, because Napoleon, rationalized the continent when he invaded it. Um, it allowed Germany eventually to come together as its own political entity in 1871. So there's Germany. And the fact that Italy and Germany had their own countries made the Irish want their own countries even more. So you saw the green and the Irish island. The issue of Irish independence became really urgent in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, and it dominated politics. And you can see that in this political cartoon, the Irish question, as it was called, was dragging Asquith, Lloyd George, and Churchill by the nose. So it dominated the political agenda. And the difference between Irish nationalism and Welsh nationalism was that the Irish wanted their nation state and they didn't want to be part of the empire and they did not want England to rule. The Welsh were more concerned with the preservation of their culture and the preservation of their language. So the important thing to note here, and I'll summarize, is the international context. You can see how calls for Irish civil war, Irish unification came to a head after Italy reunified, Germany reunified, and the ideology of the nation state took hold. And this is the period when, the idea of England, the idea of Scotland, the idea of Wales took hold amongst the populations, when the idea of England being an Anglo-Saxon country came to the fore. Essentially, there is a knock-on effect. The German nation states forming its own country influenced Ireland, and Ireland influenced Wales and influenced England and Scotland. So at this point, around 1890, Cymru, Scotland, and England were forming their own ideas about how they wanted to be ruled. And this process, again, the Home Rule discussion was interrupted by World War I, but even that didn't stop Ireland from achieving its own revolution. So this is probably the last political map I'll show you. This shows the situation of the Westminster state in 1906. England also bought into the radical ideas of David Lloyd George and Asquith at this time. Ireland was even more nationalist. Wales was almost entirely liberal again, as was Scotland. And then by 1918, these differences are more pronounced. You can see that most of Ireland supports Sinn Féin, and this group of members of parliament formed their own parliament called the Dáil. The Ulster Unionists formed their own parliament. The Welsh were still liberal, and so were the Scottish. And you notice these areas of red starting to appear. This is where the Labour Party started to gain electoral success and slowly displace the Liberals. And this map essentially shows on the left that the Liberals had a backing everywhere for a strong program for old age pensions, the foundation of the welfare state, as it's called, the disestablishment of the churches in Wales, and for home rule for all of the countries. And it took a while to implement the program because the war interrupted it. But by the time of 1918, things had happened. The politics of each country becomes very apparent. Um, there is a war that just happened, and the Irish essentially have declared their own independence and started a war of independence with England. So I'm going to talk about some of the key figures involved with these political shifts. The first, this figure here that I'm going to talk about is probably the most substantial figure of the age. This is David Lloyd George. He had a great impact on the 20th century. He's kind of second only to Churchill in this respect. He's often overlooked. He had the political talent of his generation. He was a leader of Cymru Fydd, this movement that calls for home rule for Wales, and he supported small countries, especially, for instance, during the Boer War. He supported the Boers. He didn't like the British Empire taking over South Africa. And as a consequence, he had to be extracted from one of his meetings disguised as a policeman because he was surrounded by a mob. He implemented the people's budget and crushed the House of Lords. So essentially, he negated the veto of the House of Lords through his political talent. And the thing that he's remembered most for was winning the war in World War I. He reinvented the executive, he reinvented how you ordered munitions, and he took the premiership from Asquith. And in doing so, he split the Liberals, allied with the Tories, and ironically tried to crush the Irish uprising, as they thought of it. And at the same time, he fought for home rule for Wales. But essentially, he was perceived to have sold out Wales. So this is a depiction of Lloyd George as the people's champion. He fought the rich, the plutocrats, with his people budget. It wasn't implemented until 19 because you had to crush the House of Lords, and he did that with the passage of the Parliament Act. And to get that done, they had to have 2 general elections and threaten to implement the appointment of a lot of House of Lords, members of the House of Lords. And his depiction is of almost as a barbarian here, sort of like a wild man. This is a picture of him late in his career, around 1922. And you notice he is turned into a goat. Lloyd George was somebody who evoked strong opinions, especially in English people. And it suggested his venality and corruption. So a lot of folks thought that Lloyd George was venal and corrupt, and he was. But he also was a reformer. So he was a very, very complicated man, and it's hard to do him justice in a short talk. But essentially, all Welsh hopes for home rule hung on Lloyd George, and essentially he failed. And the other thing I'd mention is that this fight for Wales existed in a context where there was a lot of prejudice against the Welsh. And again, I'm not going to touch on it too much, but Cymru Fydd and Lloyd George and Tom Ellis had to deal with either hostility or indifference to Welsh nationality. Some folks didn't believe that Welsh nationality existed. They thought Wales was part of England. Some people thought Wales was barbaric. So there were popular novels associated with essentially science fiction, saying that, imagine what happens if England civilization collapsed, the Welsh and the Irish would take over, and it would be terrible. Figures such as John Maynard Keynes used racist language to describe Lloyd George. This siren, this goat-footed bard, this half-human visitor to our age from the hag-ridden, magic and enchanted woods of Celtic antiquity. So they perceived the Welsh, the Scottish, the Irish to be backward. And even today, in more contemporary times, Matthew Paris essentially asserted that the English and the British are the same. So we won, he says. The Celts lost. We, the English, are the nation. And we don't think we should mention it to the others. So it's an example of like how British nationalism changed because the English started to think of themselves as an Anglo-Saxon people as opposed to an imperial people that ruled an empire. If you are an imperial people, you tend to be more tolerant about differences, and English nationalism, as time has gone on, has become not very tolerant of difference. So for the last 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about Cymru Fydd specifically. Cymru Fydd was formed in 1886 by Welsh people in London, and it talked about Welsh policies. And those Welsh policies are for the benefit of Wales. So that meant a Welsh Parliament. It meant legislating for the disestablishment of the Church of England in Wales. It meant having control over education. And it meant stopping land enclosures by the Anglican class that owned the land and, took land away from the poor people. So it was a very interesting movement in that it had a full commitment to equal voting for women, which kind of leapfrogged the position of women in England. It was very controversial in England for equal votes for women, but not in Wales. And it had its most leverage between 1892 and 1894. So it was a putative Welsh nationalist party, but it did have its problems. It didn't really capture the imagination of the emerging working classes. It was concerned with cultural issues and linguistic issues and some of these reform issues that I've just mentioned. So this was its platform. This organization was founded around the same time as the Scottish Home Rule Association, and also at the time, again, when people started thinking of themselves as Anglo-Saxon. So the movement lost steam in 1896 because of a meeting between Lloyd George and the other Liberal MPs. And there are different theories as to why it lost steam and why that meeting happened. The story essentially centers on this meeting. Lloyd George was unable to join the forces of the North and the South, and he was shouted down by the other MPs who did not want, quote, Welsh ideas inflicted upon them. And Lloyd George's contention was that the meeting was stacked with English people, and he might have been right. But essentially, the difference was between the Southern Welsh who wanted more economic prosperity and didn't think that Home Rule would do that for them, and the Northern Welsh who essentially thought that Home Rule would preserve the language and the culture. However, Cymru Fydd did do some things. It essentially established the equality of Wales as a de facto country within the United Kingdom by 1912. It sort of withered away after the 1896 meeting. And it was displaced by the Irish question, essentially with the civil war that was brewing in Ireland from 1912. And the Welsh were satisfied by the implementation of um, disestablishment in 1914. And essentially, you can regard this movement as having mixed results. Um, it achieved cultural preservation at the expense of not being a state, essentially. The disestablishment funded the Welsh university system, and various powers of devolution started to be put in Wales's hands as early as the start of the 20th century. And this process continued with the National Assembly of Wales, which became a parliament in 2020. So why didn't Wales, this is kind of like the conclusion, why didn't Wales become independent? And the answer is the mentalities. I mean, it's really odd looking back and trying to put your mind into the mentalities of the people at the time. But the striking thing is that they were so pro-monarchist and so pro-empire that they couldn't conceive of being anything but a dominion. So they thought that they would have independence as a nation, but only within the context of the British Empire. That's because the Welsh played a part in the English Empire, and it reinforced their identity as Welsh people. And that happened for the Irish too and the Scottish. And the empire enabled Cymru to flourish, and they didn't want to change that. And the Irish, in contrast, were not fooled by the monarchy. They did not like the idea of being ruled by a foreign power, which would frustrate their ability to be a socialist state. So I'm quoting Connolly here, which essentially says, a people poisoned by the adulteration of royalty can never attain social freedom. So his quote is a little bit more nuanced than that, if you look for the original. But essentially what he's saying is Wales was just too subservient to the English crown. And the Irish were just more bolshy, if you pardon the expression, about wanting their freedom. So the debate essentially is, was Cymru Fydd a popular movement? And some people like Kenneth O. Morgan and others think it was a paper movement associated with Lloyd George. And there's no real evidence, I think, to say that it was paper or not. I think it needs more research. And Lloyd George never really did give up on Home Rule for Wales. He just did it in the wrong way. And it achieved success, but the debate is about how much that success was. And it's more cultural. I think it's allowed us to speak the Welsh language to this day, but it didn't help the idea of a Welsh state. So what happened, I think, was that Lloyd George made a mistake. He tied Home Rule for Wales to Home Rule for Scotland, to Home Rule for Ireland. And as Prime Minister, he could have done something different. He could have just made Home Rule for Scotland and Wales separate, and we could have had Home Rule earlier. And could things have been different? I think yes. There's a famous thought experiment about Hitler, where you imagine a world without Hitler and, the Depression and 1918, and you think about what a regime in Germany would have been like with the Depression without Hitler. Would it have been anti-Semitic? Yes. Would it have initiated a program against all Jews in Europe? Probably not, with the Chancellor Goering. So personality has a role to play in history, and if you didn't have a Mussolini or if you didn't have a Hitler in charge at the time that they did, things could have turned out very differently. And I think the same could be said about Lloyd George because he was such a significant figure. Lloyd George affected not only World War One, not only Versailles, not only the fate of the Liberal Party, he affected the fate of Wales. And he tied Welsh independence essentially to the independence of Scotland and Ireland and England and failed. And the last thing I'll point out, other than the reading and some questions, and I'm sorry for going over by about 3 minutes, is this image from 1950. This image shows an old man, an old liberal, being challenged about whether there would be a Welsh Senedd. And I don't know whether you can see what the what's happening in the background of this cartoon, but essentially it's portraying the Tories as being English nationalists who cultivate good little Cymros, and Labour who promise home rule but never deliver. And the Liberals themselves are just out of date. So essentially, most of the 20th century is a product of what happened in the 19th century and Labour taking over from the Liberals and failing to deliver on home rule, just like Lord George failed to deliver home rule. So the last thing I'll show is what I've read to get here. So the definition of like what a country should look like and how people imagine countries to be is from Benedict Anderson. And there are various histories that you should read about Cymru Fydd from different perspectives. John Davis's History of Wales is particularly important. John Griggs' biography of Lloyd George is really good. If you want to learn about the mentalities of the Welsh during the mid-Victorian generation and how they never really were British, read Theodore K. Hoppen. If you want to learn about the contingency of like how things could have been different, the late Geraint H. Jenkins wrote, about it in his History of Wales. There's an excellent and very recent book called Rebecca's Country about the state of Wales and the connection of poverty in the state of the country to unrest by Rhian E. Jones. The standard account of like what happened is Kenneth L. Morgan's Rebirth of the Nation, and some interesting reads which are out there are Gwyn Alf Williams's When Was Wales, who's not really a Marxist, he's a Marxian. He used Marxist methods of analysis, but he's an interesting read, and he was a Welsh nationalist. And Winford Vaughan Thomas, who was a Whig historian, and both those guys debated about Wales in the mid-1980s in a TV program. So if you ever get a chance to see that, I thoroughly recommend it. So pretty much that concludes my presentation, and there is one question, I think.
Yes. Paige, do you want to unmute and just ask your question and maybe you want to
Yeah.
add to it?
Sure. I was just curious. I'm not familiar with the term paper movement. Is it something that exists, say, mostly in leaflets, and in campaigning rather than something that we think of as arising directly from a larger group of people, or am I completely off?
I actually think that that's an open question.
Okay.
I am not sure what K.O. Morgan means by it. And to your point, it could mean it's nominal,
Yeah.
or it could mean that it was a front, or it could mean that it was literally just focused on pamphlets. I don't think it was those things, but I need more access to the archives to figure that out. I know
Understood.
that
Yeah.
I know that there was a the the argument from K.O. Morgan is that there was no support whatsoever for Welsh nationalism, and I think that is flat out wrong. I mean, I dug into the archives, and some of the things that I found indicate that some, especially Welsh speakers, which were half the population at the time, wanted British republics, four British republics, and talked about the Saxon government wanting to wipe our language and way of life off the face of the earth. That doesn't indicate to me that there was no demand for Welsh nationalism at all. So, I, so it's an open question and needs more research.
Well, thank you for a fabulous talk. I learned a lot.
Any other questions? I know I talked for
Well, I wanted
long.
to jump in and just in response to what you just said, Hugh. There are quite a few things that come to mind, but you were mentioning this sort of this imputation that there was even, or, this desire to sort of wipe out the Welsh language and Welsh culture, Welsh identity that was perceived by plenty of Welsh people at the time. And an interesting little fact is that the blue books, the Llyfrau Gleision, which were published in response in the 1840s in response in 1847 in response to all the unrest in Wales, which basically said that the Welsh language made the people of Wales immoral, and this is why the uprisings occurred, and and then sort of argued for English language education, and obviously was opposed to the nonconformist majority in Wales. An interesting fact is that that was called by the Welsh Brad y Llyfrau Gleision, the treachery of the betrayal of the blue books, and that was a deliberate echo of an episode in early sort of Welsh legendary history, which was called the Brad y Cyllhirion, or the treachery of the long knives, which was an incident that supposedly happened in say I think the 5th century, where the Anglo-Saxons were coming into Britain, and they gathered the Welsh into a meeting, and then retrieved knives from their shoes and massacred them. So it was there were lots of deliberate. This is a time when you have the Eisteddfodau, you have a real appreciation among even working people of the history, both factual and pseudo-historical, of their culture. And so yeah, I mean, people had a deep sense, I think, of their cultural identity, and that played into a growing sense of national identity, and just also a precursor to Cymru Fi, the precursor to this late 19th century nationalism. You have Michael D. Jones. He was also arguing for home rule for Wales, and he'd spent well over a decade in the United States, actually. He had relatives in Ohio. He was ordained a minister in Cincinnati. And then, that was his experiences there, and seeing the Welsh assimilate more into American culture. Then, that inspired the establishment of his support for Owaladva in Patagonia. But that was itself a nationalist project as well, even if it was, removed from Wales. So, I think, I think you're right that there was a lot more. There was a lot more assertion of Welsh identity and Welsh national identity in 19th century Wales than people are given credit for.
Mhm. You're not going to find an argument here.
Yeah.
I do have some of those points in the presentation, but I didn't elucidate on them this time.
I'm sorry.
Oh no, that's
This-
Luann. You have a question. Go ahead.
Yes. Is there any comparison to be drawn between Welsh desire for independence and potentially a Cornish desire for independence, or a Cornish, we're not really Britons?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, at the moment, demand for Cornish independence exists. It's not as great as it was in the last century, primarily because it's easier to swamp um, Cornwall with incomers, so that the Cornish are a minority within their own country. They certainly had their own, they certainly do have, and certainly had their own language and their own culture related to Wales. They essentially did many similar things, like leverage their mining expertise and exported it across the world. Mexico in particular, actually. And they, they're essentially a Celtic nation, just like Cymru is. It, it's just they're much more integrated into England than even Wales is at the moment. So I mean, it's a good observation. I mean, there are definitely parallels with Cornish independence, but the Welsh have been much more successful at preserving their language, their culture, their identity, and eventually have formed the basis of a nation state with the Senedd. Whereas you don't have that level of representation or identity in Cornwall in the current time.
Thank
Susan,
you.
oh, sorry. Thank you, Luann. Susan, you raised your hand.
Yes, I was very interested in something that I've known all my life, but I've never seen it written down, and that was the fact that Welsh people love royalty, and
Yes.
they're in love with the royal family, and I was absolutely, but I've come to see the light and see the damage over the years and everything that comes with that. And my family over in Wales and in London are, royal family fans, and there's nothing going to change them. They're in love with it, and I had a Welsh high school friend who I said, so what are we going to do when Charles tries to invest William in Carnarvon Castle? And she said, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment. My grandmother was a case in point. I'm in my 50s. I remember my grandmother being very pro-royalist. But if you talk to Welsh people of the current generation, and slightly older, slightly younger than myself,
Mm,
they're not as royalist, if at all.
right.
And to your point, there's talk about uh, expropriating the Crown estates for the benefit of the Welsh people, which has happened in Scotland, but not in Wales for no sane reason.
There's so much land in
Right.
Wales owned by the Crown.
Right. And it needs to be put in trust for the Welsh people so that it's no longer treated as a colony.
Right.
So that's literally what, enriching the monarch through possession that he's had of land since the 11th century is not democratic. So I think those things are beginning to change.
I hope so. So thank you, Huw.
Does anybody else have any questions? Or I have a few other comments, and maybe you feel you'd like to respond or add to them. But um,
Absolutely.
to go back to the just this is sort of a historical anecdote that people may be interested in looking into, because I read about it I'd known about it for a while, but I just read about it in some detail recently. Was an example of the power of the landlords in the mid 19th century. There was an incident in 1876. Now, this was after the 1868 election. It was after the secret ballot, But there was a landlord in Cardiganshire near Llandyssil, and there was a Unitarian chapel, and the Unitarians, you know, a religious minority within Welsh nonconformism, and in what was called the Black Spot, the Smotyn D. It was called the Black Spot by everybody else around them who didn't approve of the Unitarians. And there was a chap, and the Unitarians also had a reputation for being very politically progressive. And this was a tradition that went back to the late 18th century. Iolo Morgannwg, for example, you know, who was quite radical politically, and other people, you know, in his circle were Unitarians. And so in 1876, the local landlord of who owned the graveyard and the chapel at Llwyn Rhydowen in Cardiganshire, basically shut the people, the congregation out of the chapel because and it wasn't actually the landlord, it was actually the estate manager. The landlord was an absentee landlord who was in America at the time. But the estate manager locked them out of their chapel, and because of his perception that they were and he claimed that they were using the chapel to foment political sentiments that he didn't agree with. And obviously those would have been, you know, in favor of the Liberal Party at that time. And so the church was, the congregation was locked out. They looked into legal, because there was also, I should add that there was a lease. So the chapel had it on sort of a lease from the landlord, and the landlord had the right to kick them out if they violated the conditions that were set down in the initial agreement, and that's what they claimed. They found out that it would be too costly to actually, you know, challenge this in court, and they ended up building a second chapel just down the road. So there are two chapels at Llwyn Rhydowen. There's the old chapel, Hen Gapel Llwyn Rhydowen, and the new chapel. And actually, just after they built that new chapel, the Lord of the Manor passed away, and after some legal wrangling between the estate manager, who claimed that he inherited it, and the landlord's sister, ultimately the landlord's sister won the case. She took ownership of the estate and gave the chapel back to the congregation, the old chapel back. But this is an interesting little sort of episode in how, you know, landlords still had that amount of you know, that amount of leverage and power over their communities. And this is even after the secret ballot had been introduced. This was after the increase, you know, this was at the time of the increasing liberalism in Wales. As an interesting aside to that, the minister was a man named William Marlis, who was the great uncle of Dylan Thomas, and the chapel was also the congregation that the ancestors of Frank Lloyd Wright had attended before they left Wales in the 1840s. So anyway, that's going off on a tangent here, but I just wanted to give that as a very powerful example of that influence and power and leverage that landlords had.
Right up until 1911, I would say.
Yeah.
Because of the Parliament Act, it shifted the balance against landowners towards the Parliament, and the Parliament, you know, was at least elected. Prior to the Parliament Act, landowners could veto anything, essentially.
That leads me to ask, I'd like to ask another question based on what you just said.
Sure.
Does that mean that property rights are stronger in Wales? And does Wales have their own property rights, or are they only totally overridden by, quote, British English property rights? I'm thinking like things like in in America, we'd have eminent domain. If it's for the greater good, you give up your land, but we have a lot of personal property rights, and they are often, there's a federal law and then there's state laws. So would it be the same between England and Wales if there's something maybe more state-like in Wales versus more federal-like through the British government, or is there no such difference? Thank you.
That's an interesting question. It's outside of my area of domain. What I will say is that the property rights that exist today, especially with regard to the monarch, are antiquated, and the monarch profits off Welsh ownership of Welsh land, and in Scotland that has been essentially abolished. So the fact that the monarch has those rights is unconscionable. I think property rights in Wales and in England and in Scotland are really complicated. I don't think that there's no special right that comes from property except unless you're a lord. And again, I think that privilege sort of ended in 1911 because the lords were no longer allowed to veto bills. So if you had a lordship and a manor and land prior to 1911, you could, with your buddies, vote against land reform. After 1911, you could not vote against that because the elected house has precedence. Essentially, people with land lost a lot of influence after 1911. One of the issues of the 19th, I haven't quite finished. One of the issues of the 19th century was this process called enclosure, where landlords would essentially steal common land by claiming that they were using it better than the common people, right? Whatever the process was. That essentially depopulated Scotland and forced people out to America and the New World, and it helped impoverish people in Wales and stop them using common land. So those kinds of abuses tended to stop after 1911, but they haven't stopped completely. That I think is my answer without doing more research.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
And Huw, just to add, some thoughts on my own, because at the time, up through the 19th century, most farmers were not landowners; they were tenant farmers. Most of the time, they had very small. They were farming, just a few acres. They also, in it, they had to pay exorbitant rents. Sometimes that meant selling off livestock more than once a year just to pay the rent, in addition to tithes and taxes. And I think I think that that was a reason why they just couldn't get ahead too. So you had and then on top of that you have the taxation essentially of the toll roads, and which increases in agrarian discontent. But yeah, people, nobody really, only a very small elite really owned land in Wales in the 19th century.
Thank you. I come from an academic urban planning and historic preservation background, and a lot of history, and this whole idea of land. And I always say I got into it because I was fascinated by the way in which humans manipulate the land they're on, and the history of various land types and acquisitions. So thank you.
Well, I'd
No
like to
worries.
thank everybody for being here today, and Huw, diolch yn fawr iawn am gyflwyniad arbennig o da. Thank you for an especially good presentation. If nobody has any further comments or questions, I'll bring this this to a conclusion, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. And we will put at least some of the at least the main presentation on YouTube at some point in the coming weeks, so that people can either watch this again or catch up or share it with friends. So, diolch yn fawr iawn, and
Diolch,
we will.
diolch, Huw.
Yeah,
Diolch.
and again, this is being hosted by the Great Plains Welsh Heritage Centre. We welcome your membership and also your donations. As you know, we are trying to expand our facility. Raising funds for this right now, we've raised about $55,000 so far. And also we welcome your donations to keep our operations going as well. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to us. Go to our website, greatplainswelsh.org, and you can learn more about us there. So thank you. Diolch yn fawr.